It's Thursday, August 7th, and a very concerning storm is about to hit. And here's our severe weather outlook, and we can see that we have an enhanced risk of severe weather up here in North Dakota today. That's surrounded by a slight risk of severe weather, which stretches back a little bit further back into Montana. And then we also have a associated marginal risk of severe weather, which spans most of our risk area, but spans a little bit out into parts of the Midwest as well. And today's risk is mostly going to be fueled by the threat of some damaging winds. In our enhanced risk area, there is the potential for some hurricane force wind gust today. So definitely something to be very weather aware of as we go into the day later. And then in our slight risk area, we could potentially see anywhere between 60 to 70 mile an hour wind gusts. Then there's just a conditional chance for some 60 mile an hour damaging wind gust in the rest of our marginal risk area. And our hail risk spans most of the same areas. It's just going to be downsized slightly. And it's also going to be a bit more west. But in the earlier stages of these storms, specifically in this hatched 30% region, I do think we could see some hailstones potentially in the ballpark of 3 inches in diameter today. And pretty much anywhere else, there's just the conditional threat of 1 to 2 inch in diameter hail. And then in our enhanced risk area, there's actually going to be the decent threat of a couple of tornadoes, potentially even some that are somewhat strong. And most of the tornado threat would just be a spin up risk along a strong line of thunderstorms. And those storms could also bring a somewhat significant flash flooding risk, specifically in that corridor they're expected to track through in North Dakota, where we could see a line of potentially 5 inches of rain spanning across the state. But some other areas to look out for are along the southeastern coast and even back into the Florida Panhandle, then back in eastern Wisconsin and northern Illinois, and then just pretty much in this associated marginal risk of some high excessive rainfall in a lot of the northern plains. And in all of these marginal risk areas, there's just the conditional threat of anywhere between 1 to 2 inches of rainfall. And then before we look at our simulated reflectivity, we're going to look at our National Hurricane Center outlook. We've actually seen some pretty significant developments since yesterday. We've actually seen our risk area right off the coast of the Carolinas has been downgraded, and it is expected to track behind Tropical Storm Dexter, just be a fish storm out in the Atlantic and not pose any threat to the U.S. at all. And then our storm out here in the main development region has actually kept a similar probability of development, but it's also expected to kind of just get sucked out into the Atlantic as well and also become a fish storm. So currently, none of these are expected to impact the U.S. whatsoever, but I do think we're about to see an explosion of activity in the main development region behind this invest. And here's what the radar could look like as we go into today. We could see our first storms pop off around the midday hours. Now, these wouldn't really be severe, but they could potentially be a strong cluster of thunderstorms, and this would be initiated by some synoptic forcing, by some troughing aloft. And then we could actually see our first area of some potentially stronger storms initiated by a bit of a shortwave digging in, and potentially the development of a low pressure system back here as well. And this would be in the northeastern corner of Montana, suspectedly. And presumably this would be the start of our strong mesoscale convective vortex. Now, in the earlier stages, these storms could produce some very large hail, anywhere between 2 to 3 inches in diameter. And then this is also when that threat of some damaging winds would also ensue. But with this cluster in the earlier part of the day, it would likely only be 60 to 75 mile an hour gust, not really reaching hurricane force yet. But we are going to see quite a bit of thunderstorm development as we go into the late afternoon, along potentially an area of outflow left behind from our first cluster, some more synoptic forcing, and then also there's going to be another low pressure system down here in northern South Dakota, which could further fuel our storms and also potentially leave a remnant warm front in parts of southern South Dakota, which could actually help to strengthen some of our storms and even increase the tornado threat. But our big mesoscale convective vortex has the potential to be really where in North Dakota. This specific model run predicts it to be in the more northern portion, but we can see a big Boeing segment develop right around when the low level jet is expected to kick up. So that's why there is going to be that threat for a couple of spin up tornadoes. But during this period, the main threat would be some extreme damaging winds, likely hurricane force. And by the time it becomes as a linear cluster, the hail threat is going to be a bit smaller, but right before it, when these storms are somewhat discrete, we could see some 3 inch in diameter hail. And then this is expected to actually push into the northern part of Minnesota. And we could actually see some more storm development late at night along potentially the outflow or wake left behind from the storm. And then there would likely be some more forcing as there is going to be a trough back here pushing through parts of northwestern North Dakota. And then these storms could also potentially be severe, although it would be much more of a conditional threat at this point because this environment would have been completely spent by that very strong MCV, but just something to stay weather aware of out here in North Dakota during the night hours. And also, this is when the flooding threat would increase significantly, potentially even dropping 5 inches of rainfall. And another area where we could potentially see some strong storms would be out here in Wisconsin along a mesoscale convective vortex. Yesterday's storms could see some redevelopment in the afternoon hours. Now, this is a very conditional severe threat and would likely mostly only be for some damaging 60-mile-an-hour gust, but mostly it's just going to be some strong thunderstorms out here in Wisconsin. And here are 500 millibar winds showing us where that large-scale synoptic forcing is going to be. We immediately notice 2 features: a large high-pressure system down here in the southern plains and southwest, helping to squeeze and enhance our flow and also bringing some organizing shear, then a big trough digging in over the northwestern Rockies. And we're actually going to see a shortwave eject over our main risk area starting in the midday hours. And this is going to last pretty much all the way into tonight. And that's going to help to sustain our storms and also initiate them. And we also see some flow, which is going to help to bring that first cluster of storms as well. But the main thing is going to be a short wave pushing through the region pretty much all the way through the day, which is just going to sustain and strengthen that very strong mesoscale convective system. And then here's what our environment is going to look like in front of that very strong mesoscale convective system. Out here in North Dakota today, we do see some curvature in our hodograph, and there would likely be some very decent low-level shear and low-level helicity right in front of that mesoscale convective system. Then couple that with the low-level jet, I definitely do think there is going to be a pretty decent threat of a couple of spin-up tornadoes. Then in the earlier stages of our storms, in the mid-afternoon and around midday, when they're more discrete and that low-pressure system or mesoscale convective system is starting to develop, I also do think we could see an isolated tornado threat there as well. And our lowest cloud level or storm base is actually going to be low enough to definitely support this. Now, a couple of other things which could support this and just organized storms in general is that we do have some decent wind veering out here, and we have quite a bit of organizing shear at around 40 knots. So definitely some strong updrafts and organized long-lasting storms. Speaking about strong updrafts, we do have quite a bit of cape up here near our freezing level and a decent mid-level lapse rate, 8.3 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. And then couple that with those strong updrafts is why I do think we could see potentially some very large hail, anywhere between 2 to 3 inches in diameter with the earlier stages of our storms. And then for our damaging wind threat, we do have some dry air aloft, although it's not a bunch. We do have a decent downdraft cape around 1300. And we have a pretty high precipitable water at around 1.85. So all things which would help to support that threat of some damaging winds. And for our severe weather threat in general, we have a very moist environment for the area, 73 dew point. You don't normally see that this far north. And then we also have a very high cape at around 5,000. So very unstable, very moist, very favorable for severe weather. Then our 3 cape is also going to be 180, which will help support that tornado threat as well, and just that general threat for some strong, significant, severe storms. And then the last thing we're going to look at are our feels like temperatures today, and we can actually see a pretty significant cooling trend occurring out here on the eastern seaboard and southeast, excluding Florida, of course. In Florida, we would likely still see some low 100s feels like temperatures, but pretty much everywhere else on the eastern seaboard is going to see some of the coolest weather they've seen in probably a little over a month, around the mid 80s to low 90s feels like temperatures. Then pretty much anywhere west of that, so Mississippi, Ohio River Valley, and then Great Plains is unfortunately going to see a return of those mid 100s feels like temperatures. And then this is going to last for a couple of days, actually probably increasing in intensity. But the main takeaway is that it's going to be very hot out here in that area. And that's it for today's forecast discussion. If you enjoyed, consider liking and subscribing. And remember to stay safe, stay weather aware, and I'll see you in tomorrow's forecast discussion.